Burkina Faso gold stays home. From rock to furnace to a public scale, power changes hands. The flight path goes silent. A new refinery flame rises in Ouagadougou. Undermined, calloused hand lifts a piece of doré from the pit's dark mouth. A helmet lamp cutting a clean white line through dust and sweat. This first hand carries the highest personal risk, the risk of collapse and accident that lives underground and breathes with every shift. Prejudice on hand tilts a crucible with surgical focus, a bright river of metal pouring into a mold, heat rippling the air and painting the worker's face in living gold. This hand holds technical risk, the kind measured in uptime, temperature, and precision. Clang, then, a steady, well-kept hand sets a cooled bar on a digital scale inside a quiet government room, the readout matching a weight you can feel in your chest. 5 to 7 kilograms of decision and intent. This third hand bears the risk of institutions, governance, integrity, the simple, difficult work of keeping public value public. Hold one beat. Let silence speak. The whine of a jet fades and stays gone. A freight horn thins to nothing. That silence is a disruption. The death of an old route. The moment when distant capitals recalculate their response. Now the sound of human work returns. The low growl of an excavator from the pit. The measured breath of a furnace in the mid-distance. The new route turns inward, toward a budget line you can audit, toward classrooms lit after sunset, toward irrigation canals and cold storage that keep food alive through heat. Setbacks, Africa Rising made tangible. Not a slogan you repeat, but a ledger you can read. Here is the promise to you, stated as plainly as law and shown on screen as 3 small icons that will follow us throughout the film. Take first, the state's free carried interest of 15%, a public equity stake written into statute. It is equity, not a guaranteed profit stream. And the dividends depend on audited accounts that cannot hide behind depreciation or convenient losses. Second, the number of kilos refined at home each month, the simplest figure that tells you whether value truly stays or quietly leaks away in fees and premia. That number will rise and fall with refinery uptime, feedstock supply, and the discipline of operations. Third, the share of the national budget that comes from gold, compared with 2024. The cleanest test of whether this model funds real life or only headlines. Whether it reduces dependence on foreign aid and costly loans or merely shifts it around. We will test these 3 openly and often, and we will update them as the story advances. If they rise, you will see it. If they do not, you will see that too. Take what changes when a gold bar does not board a plane. If value stays, do skills stay in plant rooms and labs where precision matters? If value stays, does bargaining power stay at the table with traders, lenders, and the standards that police price? If value stays, does the budget line change color this year? Or is it only the rhetoric that changes? These are not decorations. They are the spine of this report, African politics explained in the order it should be told, reported first and interpreted after. There is a conscience under this data. Submerge the memory of Black liberation in Africa and the voice of Thomas Sankara, reminding us that political freedom stands on economic ground. This is the tangible legacy of a Sankarist vision, now being operationalized by a new generation. It is not about rejecting foreign investment. It is about rewriting the terms of engagement on principles of mutual benefit rather than extraction. That is what Pan-Africanism looks like when it leaves the square and enters a contract term, a refinery standard, a supply chain with provenance that can be audited and verified. If you hear an echo of an Ibrahim Traoré speech in the insistence on numbers, that is intentional. Accounting is theater. Sovereignty with accounting is policy. This is not a film about the past. Clang, it is a forecast for what comes next. And that forecast is written in gold. The bar that stays is a promise you can weigh. Tring the meter on the screen is a promise you can check. Razier that gets paved is a promise you can walk. 'Cause tonight, we will track one bar from pit to market and turn Burkina Faso gold into charts with real axes, showing how a gold refinery in Burkina can shift African sovereignty from anthem to infrastructure, and how a future that once flew away begins quietly and measurably, to remain. Begin with dates, not vibes. In December 2023, the state revoked the Wahgnion license from Endeavor Mining. It was an unmistakable warning shot across an industry that had treated departure lounges like loading docks. Filmies was simple. The era of default export was over, and compliance would no longer be a suggestion. That was a decision. Nangi decisions only matter when law follows. Through 2024 and into 2025, law did follow. The mining code raised the state's stake to a free carried interest 15%. Plain English, it is equity, not a guaranteed profit stream. The public does not front the riskiest capex at the start, but it holds real shares and receives dividends if and when the mine pays. Frustrations is redistributed by design. Private capital carries the early engineering and geologic uncertainty. The public carries the governance risk of enforcing audits, guarding dividends, and keeping public value public. Take that the hinge of this chapter, decision to law to money. Picture the money road on a map. For years, one bright line ran from the mine gate to the runway, a straight shot to refiners and traders abroad. After the new code, a second branch bends inward. It passes a school, a clinic, an irrigation canal, and a warehouse marked with a snowflake for cold chain. Each time a regulation, decree, or enforcement action lands on paper, the inward branch grows wider and brighter. The outward line remains, but it dims. Law is not a speech, law is a fork in the road that redirects cash. To see why this matters, compare the instruments governments use. A royalty of 5 to 10% is a toll on revenue. It pays regardless of profit, and when prices spike, it scales mechanically but never shares the full upside. A free carried interest 15% is different. It is a seat at the equity table. Preclades rise and margins fatten, the public's take rises with them. When prices fall, the public does not pour capital into the pit to keep things alive. The royalty is a metronome. The free carried interest is an amplifier. One keeps time, the other shares the solo. Now enter the battlefield no one glamorizes, audits. This is where the real war is fought. Not in headlines, but in spreadsheets. Can the state's auditors challenge a multinational's transfer pricing on imported equipment and management services? Can they dissect cost allocations so the local mine is not unfairly loaded with corporate overhead booked in London or Toronto? Can they test offtake prices against transparent benchmarks rather than swallowing a discount baked into a related party contract? Separate legitimate depreciation from strategic loss-making. The 15% is meaningless if the profit it rides on can be engineered away. Behind regulators and courts stands an often overlooked actor, the tax authority. Armed with the new code, it becomes the ultimate enforcer. Royalty payments, VAT on imported services, thin capitalization limits, withholding on management contracts, the treatment of hedging, reinsurance, and freight, each is a lever. The law provides the weapon, the tax authority must know how to aim it. When collections improve, contracts adjust, and cash flows change. That is the moment when nationalized mines stops sounding like a slogan and starts functioning as a policy framework. Industry will call this hostile. Prosecute a what? Prosecute to business? Or to a decades-old business model of low risk, high-margin extraction where risk is socialized and reward privatized? The new code is not hostile to investment. It is hostile to terms that priced public value out of the spreadsheet. Pause exploration or slow final investment decisions. Quarantine, some of that is bargaining, some is real. The sharper question is whether the code aligns incentives tightly enough to keep competent operators engaged while filtering out rent seekers who depended on weak oversight. That is not ideology. That is selection pressure. Which line in the budget should change color first when the free carried interest 15% hardens into law? Will dividend income from state equity move before or after royalty receipts? Will the Agriculture Ministry's fertilizer program, the very one we will test in Chapter 5, receive a predictable allocation tied to gold inflows? Will rural clinic upgrades and the cold chain build-out hit procurement schedules on time? Imized are not poetic questions. They are budget codes and calendars that can be checked. Granite to the map. The outward line still exists because exports still exist, but the price of using that line changes. Niki offtake agreements negotiated after the code tend to carry fewer quiet discounts. Logistics contracts face scrutiny. Insurance and financing fees must pass a reasonableness test. The inward branch brightens because the rules add friction to rent-seeking and reduce friction for domestic capacity. Refineries, assay labs, fabrication shops, and the vocational training that keeps uptime high. Where does the money road slow? Prosecute grid connections. Fix those choke points and the branch glows brighter. Set the geopolitics in proportion. TRAORE versus France travels well online, but filings matter more than slogans. An Ibrahim Traore speech can set tone and direction. And in the climate of African geopolitics, that matters. But statutes, regulators, auditors, and courts do the turning. When a government says it will rewrite the terms for mutual benefit rather than extraction, that is policy. If and only if contracts change and cash actually arrives. Say the measure of seriousness is not the podium, it is the payment calendar and the procurement order. So here is the sequence as it stands. December 2023 signaled seriousness by revoking Wahgnion. 2024 and 2025 turned signal into statute, statute into contracts, contracts into cash flows. Cash flows must become classrooms, canals, and cold rooms, or the promise is broken. 3 instruments will keep score. Climates marked 15% starts to pay reliably. If kilos refined per month trend upward with refinery uptime. If the share of the national budget from gold rises against the 2024 baseline, then decision to law to money is not a slogan, it is a working machine. If those measures stall, we will say so. STI is real. Wumming one road still runs to the runway. Nenken's other runs home. The future of this story, investment, legitimacy, and lives changed, depends on how well the law keeps the traffic flowing in the right direction. Ibrahim Traore, 2025, will be judged not by the volume of applause, but by the velocity of cash redirected. That is how nationalized mines becomes an operating system, and how a free carried interest 15% becomes a number you can track, not a line you forget. Follow one bar. It is born where rock is crushed and ground, floated or leached, and it leaves the plant as a rough rectangle of door, a mixed metal with stories still trapped inside. Mine begins the moment that rectangle cools. A guard signs a ledger. A camera blinks. A truck door seals. Nesday I weighed, bagged, tagged, and handed forward with an assay slip that will be tested again and again, because price is not a belief. Price is a measurement. Now give the bar a passport. Perpetual gold economy, passports are issued by standards, and the most potent passport is the LBMA Good Delivery List. LBMA is not simply metallurgy, it is market power. Dutchmall that meet its criteria trade at par in the core. Bars that do not clear at a discount, sometimes invisibly through fees, sometimes explicitly through lower bids. That is politics, hidden in process. A standard decides whose metal is liquid and whose is not, and that decision travels the whole Sahel gold supply chain. The path to that passport is real work. LBMA Good Delivery is often a multi-year cycle of audit, remediation, and building a track record. Frequently with sponsorship from an established member who will vouch for controls and quality. Disillusion goal is pragmatic. Achieve a local par status, where domestic banks and traders trust the bar enough to transact near international prices. Local par internalizes the premium long before the stamp on the mold says, Good Delivery. Bankers do not live alone. Compared frameworks exist from the SGE ecosystem to regional schemes that emphasize provenance and responsible sourcing. Choice is leverage. Burkina Faso can pursue LBMA while benchmarking against other rulebooks, using competition among standards to improve price discovery without lowering the bar on compliance. Now put a number on the opportunity cost. When a bar exits as door, value leaks through the familiar set of drains, processing fees charged abroad, insurance and air freight, discounts while a foreign refiner waits for its own assay, and the good delivery premium captured at someone else's plant. The same metal, once certified, can be worth 5 to 10% more than d'Or. For years, that uplift flowed to Swiss plants and to Dubai refiners. The strategy now is simple to state, hard to execute: refine at home, certify at home, and keep that 5 to 10% uplift at home. Execution runs into an unglamorous wall. Cash top. The refinery's success is as much a test of the central bank's innovation as it is of the plant manager's skill. The toolbox is standard but must be localized. Revolving credit lines that accept serialized bars as collateral. Warehouse receipts lenders will discount. Repo windows where the central bank treats gold like eligible collateral. Hedging programs, forwards, collars, metal loans that turn volatile metal into predictable cash flow. Without that finance stack, uptime starves. With it, the plant breathes. LBMA compliance is not a single switch. It is a system. Raise your KYC and AML to know who touches the ore. And weighbridge controls to know what enters and leaves. Dual assays and third-party checks so purity is not a negotiation. Regular audits and documentation so an external reviewer can reconstruct every movement of metal. Kick one leg out and bids go thin. Build a whole table and bids normalize at par. The practical question is not whether LBMA wields power. It is whether Burkina can wield standards for itself. So a bar stamped in Ouagadougou clears like a bar stamped in Neuchâtel. Follow the bar upstream to artisanal and small-scale mining. ASM is both livelihood and risk. Informal, dangerous, mercury-heavy when left alone, safer and traceable when organized. The policy is to formalize, not criminalize. Create buying centers that post transparent prices and pay a small premium for documented ore. Offer mercury reduction kits and training. Require basic safety gear. And register co-ops. Prohibit consignments. Serialize receipts. And tie payments to identity. So tonnages and grades reconcile. A core's not perfection. It is a chain of custody strong enough for auditors and generous enough to raise incomes without feeding smuggling. That is what a Pan-African movement looks like when it leaves the square and enters a weighroom. Hubs and habits complicate the route. Switzerland still polishes its reputation on mirror finish bars, and Dubai's rise has changed both the roots and the tempo of African metal. Dubai is a double-edged sword. It offers new, often looser outlets for gold, which can undermine the pressure to build domestic capacity. Burkina's model challenges that dynamic, seeking to replace a re-export logic with domestic value addition. The aim is not to wall off trade, but to bargain from a different footing, where refinery capacity in Ouagadougou gives the Treasury a price discovery tool, and gives miners a floor set by a domestic bid. End market acceptance matters too. Will a bar bearing a Burkina Faso mark be taken at par by jewelers in Europe, the United States, or Asia? The answer is built with repetition. Publish uptime, throughput, and rejection rates. Plainly average settlement times and the spread between internal assays and third-party checks. Publish the average discount or premium achieved each month. Do that, and lenders price lines without guesswork. Do that, and counterparties begin to accept serialized bars on site. Do that, and the LBMA conversation moves from if to when, because markets reward predictability even more than rhetoric. There is a moral ledger beneath the financial one. Can the new route reduce mercury use in ASM sites? Can it reduce incentives to traffic conflict gold across porous borders? Can it pay a working premium that buys time for safety practices to take root? The politics of standards is not only about access to par pricing, it is about the dignity of the hands that lift the ore in the first place. Who writes the rule that gets your bar accepted? When a refinery flame burns in Ouagadougou, will the market listen to a new story? The decision will not be made by slogans, but by a chain of custody that stands up to audit, a financing stack that keeps metal moving without starving cash, and standards met so consistently that even old habits nod and make room. That is how a supply chain becomes a character in its own right, and how a country writes itself into the script of a market it once served only from the outside. Open the ledger and keep the poetry outside the door for a moment. Take Wahgnion first, because its math is clean enough to teach the instrument. Assume annual output of 100,000 ounces. At $2,000 an ounce, top-line revenue is $200 million. Before the policy shift, the state's principal take was a royalty, roughly 5%, or about $10 million a year. After the shift, two streams pay the public, the same 5% royalty plus dividends from a 15% free carried interest. If net profit margins sit where competent plants often land, the public's dividend can equal about 5 to 7% of revenue. Add that to the royalty, and the state's cash flow moves to roughly $20 to $24 million. One mine, one change. A public take that roughly doubles. Spell it out as a formula so no one gets lost in acronyms. Crimson to the state equals 15% of net profit after tax. Net profit after tax equals revenue, minus all-in sustaining costs, minus sustaining capex and debt service, minus depreciation and tax. If a realistic AISC band sits around $1,200 to $1,400 per ounce, then at $2,000 gold the unit margin is $600 to $800. Multiplied by 100,000 ounces, that yields 60 to 80 million in operating margin before the accountants finish. Strip out sustaining capex, debt service, depreciation, and tax, and you still retain a profit pool large enough that 15% plausibly lands near $10 to $14 million. Stack that on top of the $10 million royalty, and the combined public number is 20 to 24 million. The royalty is a metronome. The free carried interest is an amplifier. One D keeps time, the other shares the solo. Make it visible. Titular the screen. How the same rock produces a different song, and push a full-frame Sankey across it. Trade channel runs from mine gate to foreign, refining fees, air freight and insurance, management services billed from abroad, and off-take discounts negotiated off-screen. A thin tributary bends back to the treasury as royalty. On the afterpass, those fee channels narrow. A domestic refinery and assay loop appears. A fatter stream labeled royalty plus dividend, FCI 15%, flows to the treasury. More tributaries remain in country through local procurement and payroll. Animate the lines tightening and widening in sync with the narration. Let the numbers change the picture, not the other way around. Projectile to a second graphic, an on-screen 3-line infographic that viewers could operate if this were interactive. Unmistakable. Revenue, $200 million. Lamink 2, royalty, about 5%, $10 million. Ubiquitous 3, estimated dividend from FCI 15%, $10 to $14 million, depending on the final profit pool. To the right, show two simple toggles, a gold price slider that shifts revenue up and down, and a cost slider that moves AISC between $1,200 and $1,400 per ounce. Watch the dividend breathe with price and efficiency. Stormed propaganda, it is what equity exposure does. In a boom, the public rides the uplift. In a slump, the public does not pour early billions into the pit to keep the music playing. Name the battlefield that decides whether the dividend is real. Accounting. Trust transfer pricing is where be reverse engineered. Can auditors challenge management fees charged from a parent in London or Toronto at rates no independent buyer would accept? Prosecute, can they interrogate equipment imports invoiced above market or freight and reinsurance that smells like internal markup? Can they compel disclosures on related party offtake so the mine does not sell to a sister company at a quiet discount that bleeds the profit pool? Take a 15% equity stake means nothing if the profit it rides on can be engineered away. This is the Excel war, and it is fought line by line. Behind the regulator and the courts stands a third actor that rarely gets its close-up, the tax authority. Armed with a new code and guidance, it becomes the ultimate enforcer. Royalty audits, VAT on imported services, thin cap rules on intra-group loans, withholding on management contracts, the treatment of hedge gains and losses, each is a lever. Plunge them correctly, and cash appears. Miss them, and the profit migrates. The Ibrahim Traoré projects live or die where legal instruments meet competent examiners. Widen the lens to Ouagadougou. The structure is the same even if the cost stack differs. Exacerbated or stabilization phase may demand catch-up capex, safety retrofits, and fleet overhauls that pull cash forward. That makes year 1 and year 2 noisy, but the instrument still works the same way. Royalty pays on revenue regardless, dividends pay when profit clears. The state does not front the riskiest spend, yet holds a real equity seat. The patience question is not philosophical, it is operational. Can uptime converge on plan? Aunge can grade and recovery meet model? Can procurement localize without compromising reliability? And above all, can the audit function keep transfer pricing honest, so dividends are a number, not a theory? Do not romanticize the counterparty either. Firefight and peers will say the code is hostile, that it slows exploration and raises hurdle rates. Is bargaining, some is real. Crimea risk premia push up the weighted average cost of capital. The risk-free rate, plus a sovereign spread, plus equity risk premia climbs. Projects need fatter margins to pass. That is the challenge. The answer is not to retreat from public equity. It is to make the public streams predictable. When royalty and dividend arrive on schedule and audits are credible, perceived risk falls and the cost of capital follows. The cheapest capital is trust. Cash conversion still matters even in a case study about policy. Domestic refining pulls the 5 to 10% uplift home only if the financing stack exists to keep metal moving, revolving credit lines that accept serialized bars as collateral. Warehouse receipts domestic lenders will discount, hedge books that translate metal into schedule. Without those tools, a vault full of gold is illiquid, and an illiquid vault suffocates operations. With them, you get breathing room, vendors paid, payroll met, and sustaining capex funded without panic. The melody, finance keeps time. Cousins to the Sankey and let the camera drift from the treasury box to 2 icons labeled Road Program and Clinic Upgrades. Fade up the sound of a report printer as the quarter closes. Resolve into a calmer chord as procurement orders book. That is the narrative bridge to social outcomes. If the public take truly doubles, viewers should see more than lines on a screen. Asthma and stocked pharmacies produces a different song is not just a title on a chart. It is a promise the series will keep testing. Regulate this frame the next steps. Patience versus accountability. Year 1 can be messy. What does year 5 look like if the structure works as designed at Wahgnion and Bongo? Second, roads, literal and figurative. When the bar stays, who stops tolling the old route and who starts paving the new one? In this series, answers are not a matter of faith. They live in revenue, royalties, dividends, AISC, and cash conversion cycles. If the measures move, the African Revolution becomes something you can walk and taste. If they do not, we will say so and follow the money until the story earns its ending. Bongo, Wahgnion. Endeavor Mining. Different assets, same instrument. The promise lives where cash meets calendar, where audits meet invoices, and where roads meet budgets. Double the public take and keep the plants breathing, and the structure holds. Bring the camera back to the Sankey, then step off the screen and onto dirt. Unresolved at Wahgnion and Ouagadougou truly doubles. Viewers should see more than wider lines. They should see shorter travel times to clinics and fuller granaries at the end of the hot season. We translate finance into groceries, asphalt, and water pressure. Africa rising not as a poster, but as a shopping list paid for. Trench with a clean conversion so the ledger feels real. At benchmark unit costs, an additional $10 million from royalty and free carried interest can finance about 100 kilometers of rural road. Or it can underwrite input packages for 50,000 farming households, seeds, basic fertilizer, and a small grant for transport and storage. That is a simple, testable translation. One toggle, two outcomes. The price of distance for everyone. The input program reduces the price of survival for the people who produce food. A policy is tangible when you can point to a map and a receipt. Now formalize the promise as a public mechanism. A quarterly gold to food ledger. On the revenue side, show three numbers we already track. The royalty, the dividend from the free, carried interest 15%, and the premium retained by domestic refining. On the spending side, show three lines people can verify. Kilometers of rural road paved, hectares newly irrigated, and the count of households receiving input packs. Then add two outcome lines that are not about money at all. Percentage reduction in post-harvest losses, and hours of daily school lighting. Publish this ledger every quarter, with procurement links and delivery photos attached. Indend it means receipts, not slogans. Like a dashboard people remember. Pounding 1, the revenue meter. 3 dials, each tied to a statute and an audit trail. Take panel 2, the conversion panel. Gold dollars to food dollars to saved calories. Panel 3. A simple map with dots that change color when a road segment opens. A canal segment flows, or a school turns lights on after sunset. If the refinery's uptime dips and dividends sag, the dashboard will dim. If the audit wins a transfer pricing dispute and a dividend top-up lands, the dashboard will brighten. The point is not to choreograph optimism. It is to build a habit of measurement that outlives the news cycle. Roads and irrigation are not charity. They are operating systems for yields. A 100-kilometer lift in rural roads is not only a line on a map. It is fewer broken axles, faster trips to market, and cheaper inputs because trucks stop pricing in punishment. Fujin of input packs for 50,000 households is not a giveaway. It is a timely push against the tight window between planting and rain. Pair those with a handful of cold rooms placed like nerves at the edges of high-yield districts, and you turn days of shelf life into weeks. That is what it means to move value from a refinery's assay room into a village's pantry. Be honest about how the money should travel. Earmark a fixed share of incremental gold revenue to an agriculture and rural logistics line that is hard to raid and easy to audit. Pay contractors through e-procurement so bid histories are public. Taxpayers-based disbursements for road segments with random spot checks and satellite imagery confirming progress. Promotes input packs through co-ops and verified agro-dealers, not through one-off political rallies. Poorest who got what, when, and at what unit cost, then invite citizen groups to crowd audit delivery by SMS and photo. Sovereignty that cannot stand an audit is theater. Sovereignty that can is policy and, in time, sovereign wealth. Now the hard side of success. Say, gold inflows can overheat a small economy. Prices rise, imports surge, and other tradable sectors get crowded out. The old resource curse in a new suit. Guardrails are therefore non-negotiable. Stand up a small stabilization window. Call it a micro-sovereign wealth fund, with 2 compartments. A rainy day buffer that saves when gold prices exceed a published threshold, and a development compartment that releases funds on a predictable schedule into roads, irrigation, and cold chain. Sterilize windfalls by saving part of them offshore or in domestic instruments that do not flood the money supply at once. Tie withdrawals to physical milestones, not to election calendars. Forestry the rule, then live inside it. That is how you turn African independence from a phrase into a thermostat. Finance has to cooperate or the dashboard is just paint. Lie up revolving credit for the agriculture line distinct from refinery working capital so roads do not stop when metal flows slow. I hedge at least part of the gold revenue stream so a dip in price does not cancel a planting season. Pre-order fertilizer and seed with framework contracts that lock in volume and cap opportunistic pricing. Where possible, buy local to keep multipliers inside the economy, but not at the cost of reliability. The goal is resilience, not purity. Bring the human frame back. A road segment finished means a nurse can reach a clinic in the rain. An irrigation canal lined means a farmer can sleep without listening for the sound of a failing pump. Vigorously room humming means tomatoes survive the hottest week. These are not metaphors. They are the physical footprint of a treasury line called dividend and royalty incremental. Their taxes and their minerals fund something they can touch. The word state stops sounding like a stranger. UNFOR should also name the politics that will test this model. G contractors will lobby to change specifications midstream. Importers will push to keep cold rooms foreign. Bankers will prefer city projects they can visit by car. A micro-sovereign wealth fund will tempt finance ministries with easy fixes for short-term gaps. The antidote is boring and powerful. Rules you can read, calendars you can print, audits you can download. The more predictable the conversion, the lower the perceived risk and the lower the cost of capital for the next road and the next season. Credibility compounds. Anchor the chapter with 2 questions we can come back to every quarter. If the refinery pays, which school lights up first? Conserve tons of produce cross the hot months because a slice of margin stayed home. Threatened answers should never depend on a microphone. They should live in the ledger, in the procurement files, and on the map. Submerged, this is how a bar of gold writes dinner plans and bus routes. It is how a dividend becomes a ditch that carries water and a road that carries hope. It is the quiet grammar of Africa rising, the long grammar of African independence. If the conversions post on time and on budget, the claim of gold to food will not need a speech. It will have a receipt. We leave the dashboard of roads, clinics, and cold rooms and look down underfoot at the reason this story happens here at all. Policy can redirect metal breathing. Disregology chooses the battlefield. In West Africa, the ground made that choice billions of years ago. Picture a ribbon of ancient rocks sweeping across the map of West Africa, a roughly 2-billion-year-old system of volcanic and sedimentary rocks, pressed and folded into long, narrow corridors. Foreground is the Birimian greenstone belt. It runs in broken strands from the northwest toward the Gulf of Guinea, and Burkina Faso sits near the middle of that arc. Flooding if the earlier chapters answered how value can stay, this chapter answers why the contest is here, because the ore bodies are. Plays the map on screen. Northeastern, let the belt glow like a constellation. Senegal and Mali on the left edge, Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire on the right. And in the center, a set of mineral corridors crossing Burkina Faso like braided rivers. This is not marketing art. It is the operating system of orogenic gold. Faults and shear zones run for tens to hundreds of kilometers. Hot fluids once moved along those corridors and left metal behind, in veins you can follow with a drill, and in halos you can model in software. That is the science in one breath. Everything else is logistics and law. Context matters for bargaining power. Ghana is the mature benchmark in this neighborhood, a long-standing producer with mapped belts, dense infrastructure, and a deep ecosystem of services. Blanket's portion of the Birimian is younger in industrial build-out, not in rocks, and the underlying structures are continuous across borders. If exploration over the next cycle converts today's resources into reserves at a pace similar to other parts of the belt, a realistic ambition is to capture a meaningful fraction of Ghana's refined output at the margin, enough to move bargaining power at smelter windows, enough to justify steady refinery throughput, enough to anchor training programs and parts inventories in Ouagadougou rather than overseas. It is not a boast. It is a scenario tied to drill meters and permitting. This is why geology belongs in a policy film, not a monument. It is a promise to supply the furnace. Treadmill and in-tone belt is the supply side of that promise. When we talk about kilos refined per month, we are not speaking into the air. We are asking whether the ore pipeline, the strings of deposits along trends that cross western and southern Burkina, can keep a plant busy through up cycles and down cycles. We are asking whether the roads we build in Chapter 5 also serve drills and haul trucks, lowering unit costs and turning geology into cash flow. Keep the science plain. Orogenic systems are generous because they repeat. Ouagadougou. You rarely find one lonely deposit. You find families of deposits along structures that can be mapped and chased. That is good news for planning. Exploration is not a dart throw. It is a survey of corridors. It also means that what happens on one side of a political border often rhymes with what happens on the other because the rock did not read the treaty. West Africa gold geology in one sentence. Now bring politics back in, not as decoration but as leverage. Geology determines potential, politics determines prosperity. The first half is a map, the second half is a calendar. Python, without the map, you cannot place the bets. Without the calendar, laws, audits, contracts, and cash, you cannot harvest the bets. The Birimian puts Burkina Faso in the path of ore, the mining code, the refinery, and the budget decide whether ore becomes equity and equity becomes roads and meals. Use the map for honest constraint. Expectations should thin. Where belts cross infrastructure, paved roads, grid lines, water, unit costs fall. Where belts cross nothing, unit costs and risk rise. That is a budgeting tool as much as a geology lesson. It tells a planning ministry where $1 of road buys the most resilience. It tells a treasury why kilos refined per month cannot be willed higher than what rocks and drill rigs can supply. It reminds lenders and operators that reserve growth is a function of drill density, not speeches, and that CapEx should follow corridors, not headlines. Ambiguous the regional frame because ore bodies ignore borders. A country near the center of the Birimian can build cross-border relationships that match the continuity of the rock. Corridors do not stop at frontiers, and supply chains do not have to either. Shared sampling protocols and mutual recognition for assay labs reduce friction. Coordinated security along haul roads lowers insurance premia. Harmonized royalty bans cut arbitrage. That is African geopolitics done at the level of engineering and contracts, where the map of geology meets the map of institutions. Tie the chapter back to the scoreboard so it does not float away. Meant the free carried interest at 15% only pays what profit allows, and profit depends on grade and cost, geology and logistics. Any kilos refined per month depend on feedstock, and feedstock depends on discovery and development along these corridors, geology and permitting. The share of the budget from gold depends on whether production is steady enough to support predictable transfers into the road and irrigation lines we built last chapter. Talk the ground underwrites all three. The rule book and the grid decide how much of that underwriting clears into cash. Do not romanticize the rock. Grade can be spotty. Water and tailings management are engineering problems, not hashtags. Presidential, a cost center. Stimulate is a constraint. Community consent is a requirement. Disarm every one of those realities belongs on the same map as the glowing belt, because geology offers opportunity and geography demands discipline. A refinery flame can be lit faster than a mining district can be learned. The antidote is patience measured in drill meters, feasibility studies, power connections, and trained crews, work that looks boring on camera and decisive on balance sheets. Now fix the anchor question in white letters over the glowing map. When the ground is rich, who writes the rules for what comes out? If the answer is the people who live above the rock, the map becomes a plan. If the answer is somewhere else, the belt is only a vein in someone else's strategy. Name the places and say the name of the belt. The Birimian Greenstone Belt is not a rumor. It is the reason refinery capacity can make sense in Burkina Faso. It explains why a domestic bid for metal is not wishful thinking. It explains why a policy series about gold is being filmed here instead of somewhere with thinner veins. Geology grants the ticket to the game. Governance decides the score. From here, we move from rocks to people and rules, labor, safety, and the ESG work that turns a geologic gift into a social contract. Geology chooses the battlefield. People choose the rules. We have mapped the belt and priced the bar. Now we have to decide if along the road from pit to furnace, credibility lives or dies here. Submerge the refinery as a flame of sovereignty. It must also be a lamp of accountability. Start upstream, where livelihoods begin and risk concentrates. Artisanal and small-scale mining is complicated. A survival strategy, an entrepreneurial hustle, and sometimes a magnet for the worst things that can attach to resource booms. Guns, coercion, and children in places they do not belong. The goal is not to erase ASM. It is to manage and upgrade it. Artisanal gold formalization, so miners earn more and the country earns trust. Put structure around that promise. Create a closed, domestic loop that rewards good practice and excludes harm. Buying centers should post transparent prices and pay a small premium for documented ore. Consignments are photographed, bagged in tamper-evident sacks, serialized with QR codes, GPS stamped, and matched to a registered co-op ID. Wilmington bag carries an origin profile and a risk rating. If a site fails basic screens, presence of firearms, evidence of child labor, mercury discharged into water, purchasing pauses, and a remediation team shows up, not a press conference. When problems are fixed and verified, the site re-enters the loop. Submerged. That is what formalize rather than criminalize looks like when it touches a weigh scale. Dignity is equipment and timing, not slogans. Make PPE a condition of trade. No hard hat, no boots, no sale. Subsidize safer tech with a revolving fund. Retorts that cut mercury exposure, small gravity circuits, proper sluice mats, first aid kits, and ladders that do not break. Pair the fund with training delivered on-site and in local languages. Tie a fraction of the refinery's domestic premium to this fund so miners can see how value staying home becomes value staying alive. Publish uptake, PPE coverage, retort adoption, number of trained miners, and injury rates per 200,000 hours worked. If the numbers do not improve, the policy is talk. The refinery is a gate, and gates define standards. That conflict gold is simply changing routes. Burkina must prove continuously that plant and paperwork meet the highest bar. That means a compliance stack aligned with the LBMA Responsible Gold Guidance and the OECD Due Diligence Guidance. Full chain, KYC, AML. Supplier risk mapping. Enhanced due diligence for high-risk sources. Metal accounting with no tolerance for unexplained gains or losses. And third-party audits by firms that will publish non-conformities and corrective actions on a timeline. Add ISO 14001 and 4511 for environment and safety management, and the cyanide code if chemistry is in use. If a shipment trips a red flag, the pause suspend exit ladder must fire automatically, with a public note explaining why. This is ESG in African mining as operating system, not press release. Make trust visible, not mystical. Alongside the financial scoreboard, run an ESG tape that updates quarterly. Injury frequency rate, mercury intensity per kilogram of ore, the number and share of formalized ASM co-ops, inspections conducted, non-conformities found and closed, grievance cases resolved within 30 days, women's share of co-op leadership, and school attendance in mining wards. Publish site lists with anonymized risk ratings. Create a public hotline and SMS channel where workers and residents can file complaints in their language and attach photos. Track response times on the same dashboard. Prosec Refinery passes its audit, show the letter. Jamorbush fails a clause, show the plan and the date it was fixed. Auditable or it did not happen. Children should not be in a pit. Period. Child labor prevention cannot be a paragraph, it must be a pathway. Build a rule that any verified child labor incident automatically triggers 3 things. Withdrawal of the child from the site with income support for the household, guaranteed school placement with a stipend for uniforms and meals, and a corrective action contract for the co-op tied to readmission. Publish counts and outcomes. If the number goes up in the first quarters, do not hide. It often rises because detection improves. The right direction over time is down, and the proof is attendance registers, not adjectives. Security is a reality in parts of the Sahel. Guns are not a governance model. Rule for weapons on site and make enforcement predictable, not performative. Positioned community watch groups, discreet policing, and technology. Geofenced buying, randomized inspections, and camera-verified handovers at buying centers. Such border MOUs with neighbors in the belt can reduce arbitrage on both ore and people, aligning with the geology that ignores frontiers. For Rutgau, there is a line between humane firmness and theater. Stay on the right side of it. Voice matters. Workers and residents need a seat in the system, not just a view of it. Establish site-level committees with elected minor reps, women representatives, youth voices, and a liaison from the health clinic. Require quarterly open meetings at buying centers where inspectors present results and miners can challenge or appeal risk ratings. Flooring legal aid for co-ops contesting decisions so due process does not become a luxury. Publish meeting dates and minutes. The point is not to slow enforcement. It is to make enforcement legitimate. Closed-loop value chains do more than tighten labor and environment. They attract capital that wants proof. Impact funds and mainstream lenders seeking traceable supply will price risk down when data is real. That lowers the cost of working capital for co-ops and the cost of capital for the refinery. It is the virtuous circle that turns ethical premium from a marketing line into cheaper money. Gen a map, defects in an audit log, and remediation on a calendar. You are speaking the language of investors as clearly as you speak to citizens. Generation in Africa acquires balance sheet weight. Market trust has an end buyer. Jewelers in Europe, the United States, and Asia will ask one question. Can I buy a Burkina-marked bar at par without reputational drag? The answer is built, not begged. Submerged in consistent audits, in public KPIs, in mass balance reconciliation that makes smuggling statistically hard, and in a suspension protocol that bites even when it hurts the month's throughput. If the numbers are honest and the rules non-negotiable, par pricing follows, because the market values predictability more than it values slogans. Set the covenant in writing so the camera can film a signature, not just a promise. Call it the Gold Dignity Covenant. State, refinery, co-ops, lenders, and downstream buyers. Blackmail to measurable floors. Zero child labor with published remediation counts. A 40% reduction in mercury intensity in 2 years with a path to elimination. 100% PPE coverage at point of sale. A 50% increase in formalized ASM tonnage within 3 years. And grievance cases closed within 30 days. De Beer access to the domestic bid and to credit lines to those floors. Unmistake them, and access narrows until compliance returns. Honesty will carry this chapter further than decoration. Publish the bad news as quickly as the good. Shameful say so, and show the fix. Lighting, ladders, guards, or scheduling. Op fails an inspection. Say so and publish the remediation timeline. An audit finds a non-conformity at the refinery. Say so and post the corrective action. Credibility compounds the same way capital does. Whose lungs pay for your jewelry? That question has an answer in data if we choose to collect it, and an answer in budgets if we choose to spend where it matters. Can a covenant replace an excuse? Yes. If standards are enforced, if numbers are public, and if the hands that lift the ore are treated as citizens first and workers second. Breaking that stays home should carry more than a hallmark. It should carry proof that dignity stayed with it. We have walked the mine, the refinery, the roads, and the rules. Now we open the contract so the audience can repeat the core idea in one breath. The most powerful reform in this story is quiet and countable. Free carried interest 15%. Put it on screen as an infographic made of 3 simple money blocks. Imagine a single, perfect bar worth $100. Before, $5 flows to the treasury as royalty. That is the toll you pay to move metal. Simple, reliable, and blind to profit. Now, the picture changes. Plunged, the treasury still receives $5 in royalty. But on top of that, it receives $7.50 as a dividend from its 15% equity stake. Sells for $100. The public share is now $12.50. Forging $7.50 is the value that stays home. Keep the math humble and honest. Royalty is a levy on revenue. It pays in booms and in slumps. The 15% stake is equity, not a guaranteed income stream. 17 margins thin. This is the individual destroyed a far body. Equity exposure means the public rides the upside, what economists call windfall profits, when they personal develop discover with a downturn path. The series practiced along radiovins computer, any of the I-cross margets, and rest of the target hawk method. After across the path, which keep the French capikax way, in after of margets about the sheed. That margets about the sheed, Ouagadougou is that 79 base. Many of last methods, path white knots scold and graduation of Wilm and in Sarifier. Where do the blocks come from inside a real cash flow? Picture a distribution is revenue. Royalty bands skim the first layer, 5% at baseline, stepping up when the gold price crosses thresholds. Then come operating costs, mining, processing, power, reagents, labor, maintenance. Then sustaining capex, then debt service, then tax. What remains is profit, and dividends are paid from that pool according to shareholding. Recipe Public's 15% sits beside private equity in the same line, not behind it. The revolution. The state is not a toll booth alone, it is a shareholder of record. The revolution is quiet because its enemies are subtle. The dividend ride depends on accounting transparency. Presidential padded, profit disappears, and the 750 block fades to gray. Why the legal plumbing matters as much as the headline. You need ring fencing so a mine's profit cannot be netted off against losses at a sister unit. Counting rules with teeth so management services cannot be billed at fantasy rates. Cali Y. You need thin cap limits so related party loans do not siphon profit into interest. Benchmarking for offtake contracts, so the sale price is tied to transparent indices, not a cousin's discount. Tightened. And you need audit teams who can read this in spreadsheets, not just speeches. So ask the first anchor question aloud. Paper says 15%. Who turns paper into cash? The answer is threefold. First, statute. Clauses that define royalty bands, ring fencing, allowable costs, disclosure duties, and local content. Second, institutions. A revenue authority with forensic audit skills. An independent regulator. Courts that enforce. Safeguard. Data. Monthly production, grade reconciliation, weighbridge and assay logs, related party registers, and a public dividend calendar. If the 750 does not land, the spreadsheet must show why. Now, flip the contract to its market-facing page. Offtake contracts are the bridge between metal and money. The pricing formula is usually simple, an LBMA reference price plus or minus a differential. Blackmail capacity, the country controls a real gate bid. Hat bid is not theater. It is a number on paper that traders must beat to win the metal. The more predictable the domestic bid, the less room there is for country discounts. Which leads to the second anchor question. When domestic capacity exists, who gets to speak the gate price? Paused should be the market, but with a home voice in it, a refinery, a central bank window, a syndicate of domestic banks. That voice erases the old habit of pricing from somewhere else. The money blocks give us the headline, but the footnotes decide whether the headline holds. A local content policy will set clear thresholds. Percent of payroll, percent of contracts, percent of SME spend. With auditable reporting and sanctions. Done right, it converts the 750 into multipliers, wage income and business capability. Easily, it becomes a quota. Roofing. Pair targets with training, vendor development, and open catalogs of qualified firms. The tax page needs one more line. Windfall tax. Royalty bands already step up with price. A windfall tax is a backstop that kicks in when prices exceed a threshold for a sustained period. Use it sparingly and predictably, and you avoid choking investment. The principle is simple. Publish the trigger, publish the rate, publish the sunset. Contracts are also about clocks. Dividends mean little if they show up whenever a board feels generous. Write into agreements a dividend policy, frequency, calculation base, record dates. tenders to calendars with fixed windows, and public bid evaluations. Put royalty payments on a statutory day each month. Build the habit that money follows the same path on the same day. Because we are building a system, not a slogan, we should name the failure modes and the fixes.
Failure Mode 1, Engineered Losses, solved by ring fencing and audits. Failure Mode 2, Gate Price Games, solved by a domestic bid and independent assay. Feminican Mode 3, Policy Drift, solved by clauses that sunset only by statute and by publishing every contract.
Bring the infographic back for a last look. The $100 bar splits into blocks. $5 in royalty. Royalty and 50 cents on average in dividend. Use $12.50 in public value. A caption reads, equity plus enforcement equals retention. Contracts are where sovereignty becomes arithmetic. Arithmetic becomes dinner and bus routes. Defiance 750 lands on time, the country will feel it. Blackmail the ledger will show us where it leaked and who signed the leak. Paper says 15%. Who turns paper into cash? Quadratic lives at home. Who speaks the gate price? Kangthos too, and the money blocks do the rest. Gold sovereignty is not a chant, it is a checklist. We measured this story with 3 instruments. A free carried interest 15% written into law. The kilos refined at home each month, and the share of the national budget from gold versus 2024. If those 3 rise together, Africa Rising is not a poster. It is a payment schedule. Decision to law to money set the spine. A revoked license signaled seriousness. A code rewrote terms. Contracts turned statute into cash flow. Follow the bar showed why standards are politics by other means. LBMA as passport, Dubai as a competing hub, domestic refining as the bid that brings the 5 to 10% uplift home. The case studies did the math. 1 mine, 1 change, a public take roughly doubled when royalty meets equity and accounting is honest. We translated margin into life. Roads, canals, cold rooms, and a quarterly gold-to-food ledger that turns gold dollars into food dollars and saved calories. With contracts, satellite photos, and SMS checks the public can audit. Regaz in rock, the Birimian greenstone belt as engine. Geology for potential and institutions for prosperity. Mangay shaft and the smelter formalize ASM, publish ESG metrics, zero tolerance for child labor, audits that bite. The quiet revolution of 15% into 3 money blocks. $5 in royalty, $7.50 in dividend, $12.50 that stays, while naming the plumbing that makes paper become cash, ring fencing, transfer pricing audits, local content that is measured not mimed, and offtake contracts that price at transparent indices. Finally, we took a meme. Why the West fears and built 4 gauges, access risk as priority fades, and the Sahel Alliance copies success. Refining displacement as par pricing becomes multi-hub, compliance friction that raises the cost of opacity and lowers it for proof, and monetary spillover as serialized bars back food for fuel trades and widen options beyond a single currency. Each fear has a KPI. Each KPI ties back to the scoreboard. What to watch next? Domestic gate share passing 50%. The local par spread narrowing towards 0 for Burkina stamped bars. 5 or more banks financing serialized bars on standard terms. Gold covering a steady published share of food and fuel imports while the sovereign curve tightens. If those triggers trip, leverage has moved from a single runway to multiple gates, from standards written far away to standards lived at home, from headlines to filings. Sovereignty without accounting is theater. Sovereignty with accounting is policy. If the 15% pays, if kilos rise, if the budget line fattens and funds clinics that stay stocked and roads that stay open, then a bar that once flew away will have built a country that can stand. And everyone will be able to see it, on a dashboard, on a map, and in the ordinary calendar of daily life. Sovereignty is not only about contracts today, it is about stress testing tomorrow. The gold story we have tracked, 591%, free carried interest, domestic refining in steady kilos, a budget line that grows, must now face the future through scenarios. Scenario analysis is not fortune-telling. It is disciplined imagination, with triggers you can measure. Base case. Mining ramps up on schedule. Security holds steady across belts and roads. The gold price drifts in a familiar channel, peer 1,000 to 2,200. Institutions gain muscle by repetition. Discharge paid on time. Declared on schedule. All content audited, published. Africa Rising is no longer a poster. It is a payment calendar the Treasury can plan around. Optimistic case. Uptime accelerates. Chromevery extends reserves in the Birimian belt. Governance signals real strength. Independent regu-teams that publish. Connexerts that enforce without fear. Gold trades above 2,300 for 6 straight months. ESG credibility draws in clean capital from funds once skeptical. In this path, the sovereign curve tightens. The spread to Eurobond yields narrows, and Burkina Faso becomes case study, not cautionary tale. Pessimistic case. A shock intrudes. Security flares in the Sahel, or logistics falter at a border. Gold dips below 1,900. Refining output slips. Local banks hesitate. The Treasury still receives royalty, but dividends thin, and the 750 block shrinks to gray. Sovereignty without resilience feels exposed. Black Swan. It's a mine or refinery and disables it for months. Production falls not by percentage points, but by halves. The legal plumbing is still there, but cash flows halt. This is the nightmare, where geology stands ready, but politics or conflict freeze the tap. Black Swan is not prediction. It is a reminder that systems must be designed to absorb blows without collapsing. Across all scenarios, one truth anchors the analysis. Internal political stability and institutional capacity decide more than the global gold price. A boom in bullion means little if revenue authorities cannot enforce ring fencing. A dip in bullion is survivable, shields if institutions are trusted and reserves are managed. The million-dollar question is sharper. Can the model survive the cycle of power, not just the cycle of price? The scoreboard remains the same. Free carried interest 15%, written in law, tested in practice. Kilos refined at home each month. Share of the national budget from gold compared to 2024. If those 3 metrics rise together, scenario labels matter less. If they fall, even the best headlines mean little. So the anchor question becomes collective. Which scenario do you choose? And which numbers are you willing to measure? Because when the numbers rise, nothing else can honestly be said to remain unchanged.